Hello, it's Stef from Hobbies Around Craft. We're going to be doing some projects that are already set up and on the Mako website that are using their fantastic glazes. And we're going to be using those projects and all of that information onto lots of different kinds of bisque so that it will give you some workshop ideas. So moving forward, you can have a look in your studio and say, oh, I've got an awful lot of this shape. I wonder how I can use a project and all of its great ideas on that particular shape and sell that as a workshop. So here in our in the website, you can see that Mako have all of the instructions ready for us to just print off. We can have those in a binder, and it's got all of the instructions and all of our supply list and a fantastic photo that shows us hopefully what it will look like afterwards. So I would always suggest, if you're going to be doing a workshop, always practice first yourself. You want to time it to make sure that it fits into the frame of amount of time that you're giving to your students, and also that it fits with how you're going to be able to fire it and return it back to your customers as well. And having that practice is excellent. Excellent practice. Right, so this is a particular project that was done. It's called a birch tree plate, and it was done on a plate. But we thought it would look fantastic on a lovely tall jug. You can imagine this with all the foliage coming out of it. Already it's trees and looking into a meadow, and then you've got all sorts of wonderfulness coming out of your actual vase, so if we use it for that. Another piece that we thought was this fantastic planter. So these are both Bisque Imports products. This one is the Perfect Picture, and this one is a planter. So you can see it comes with a fantastic little stand and is a great project. I always think this would also work well as a little pen pot, or have a lovely fern coming out of it, or holding makeup brushes. It's a really versatile little piece. But we're going to paint this in real time. The idea for this is that we have a forest scene. So we have the trees and all of their blossom here. In the background, looking further into the forest, we can see speckles of dappled light. And here below, we've got the meadow. So if I show you on this camera, it gives a little bit of an idea of the perspective. So this part especially can be whatever you want it to be. So imagine this being a pixie glen, and then using the peppermint twist, sort of CG968 here in the background, and that has a lovely white and rich pink speckle on a pink background. That would be amazing. I keep on looking down because I have to remember all these clever numbers. CG753 is sassy orange, so that's got a lovely warm yellow background, and then the speckle being red and green, so a fantastic autumnal look. So imagine if you had all these jugs in a row up on a shelf, offering this as a workshop, and then people can really personalize them with whatever they were wanting to put it into. So it might be something that would be something in their garden room, or a conservatory, or up in their kitchen all year long, just putting all sorts of fantastic blooms in it and showing it off, because it's a really fantastic piece that you don't really need to worry about where you're going to put it, because you're always going to have it out and it'll be full of flowers. So we're going to take our Perfect Picture, and the first thing that we have to do is we give it a wipe down, and I've already done that, and then we're going to put a good layer of foundation white all over it. So this is FN1, and I'm going to use a big brush to do that, and we always love a fan brush. These are one of the newer larger mop brushes that we have also here at Hobbies Around Craft, and I quite enjoy this one too. So I'm going to mix it up today, and I'm going to use this particular brush for my background. So I'm going to put a good lovely layer all over this piece. There I have a Perfect Picture that I have painted with 2 coats of foundation white FN1. You'll have noticed that I also painted the bottom, and I've roll glazed the inside with clear glaze or I could paint foundation in there as well if I wanted a shot of colour. On this one I've put some tangerine foundation inside it, but it's absolutely up to you. But I like to do that in advance, especially if I'm doing a workshop, because a lot of the outside is going to take a little bit of time and you want it to dry nicely so that when your customers come to put their hands inside it, if they're going to be painting it, that they're not making too many dinks and marks inside of that liner glaze. I've painted the bottom. Because we're painting this with crystal glazes, we're not going to dip that into our main glaze bucket because we don't want any of the crystals to come off in the bucket and then find its way into our future projects that we're dipping in. So we will not be dipping this particular project. So I want to make sure that I have got glaze all over it because it's going to go straight from the workshop ready to be dry footed. I'm going to dry foot these and put it straight into the kiln ready for firing. When you do a workshop, you might be doing a number of people all at the same time, and the less work that you have to do in the final finishing, the better, because you're able to then turn that around. The customer can have their piece ready for their centerpiece in their kitchen beautifully quickly, and then they're ready and they love it and they'll want to book onto your next one as well. So I've got my 2 layers of foundation here. So the next instruction is to tear paper to be the width of our trees. You can see here on my sample that my trees are quite smooth. I started by following the instructions and tearing the paper out of newsprint, and I found that it was quite jagged, and I thought that silver birches are smoother than that, so I discarded that idea and I then started to practice and found that photocopy paper works quite well. And so to tear the height that I want, I just check the height of my photocopy paper and then I tear it, not too wildly, in a straight-ish kind of line. Now, trees are not always straight up and down, and your customers will be like, oh, mine's all wonky and mine's all terrible. But if you have a nice selection of them and you get quite a few bits, they can choose from the ones that they like the best, and they will make a lovely forest of trees from those. So I take my jug, which has its foundation layer on it, and then I take a bowl of clean water and just pass my piece of paper through it, the water, make it so wet, and then not leaving too much time because the paper is now very fragile, and even if it tears it doesn't matter because you can rebuild your tree like that. And then I have a damp sponge and I just pat on there, making it a little bit straight because you don't want them to look like they're falling over quite as much. And then, so the gap between my trees, I try and vary. So I try and put the larger part, if I've got a fatter and a thinner end of my tree, I try and put the fatter part at the bottom, and then I put the thinner part a little bit higher up. And what I am doing is I'm trying to vary. These are not stripes. This is a random collection of trees that we just happen to be looking at in the forest. So they have not chosen necessarily how close they're going to be to their neighbour. And I would like that to be represented so it's not too straight. And you know how hard it is to be random, don't you? You always try and get perfection and the right amount of gaps between your things. So just see, this is the speed that I do it. I do it quite fast so I'm not overthinking it, which is easier said than done. It helps if you've got all of your strips cut in advance. So I have them all stuck down now. An important thing to do is just have a little count up. See how many you have. just because you want to take them off after you've got them all covered in paint, it's useful to know how many you've got in case you forget one. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, are they quite mixed up in different, yes, I think they are. So I've got a white jug covered with white paper. It's not very interesting just yet. So my next step is to take my fan brush, whichever brush you like. You want something that's nice and big, and you want to have your crystal glazes ready to go. So whichever 3 you've chosen, so if you're doing the one that's here in the sample, we have got from the top here Tree Frog, and Tree Frog's number is 987. Then the next one here we have is Herb Garden 2714. I'm getting them in order, they should be like this. And then we have Meadow down at the bottom, which is aptly named 979. So we have those 3 glazes that we're going down there, but you could always mix it up whatever you wanted to do. I'd love to see what they look like. So I have them open, and crystal glaze is always great because they have this wonderful phrase, art in a jar, which is absolutely true because you just paint them on and they look stunning. So we know that our glazes are glass, colour and water, but crystal glazes are glass, colour and water, and then chunks added into them. So those chunks love to live at the bottom of the jar. So using the back of a plastic brush, we give it a good scrape around. It's not the most soothing sound, but once it gets a little less gritty, you know that you've dislodged all of those chunky parts from underneath in that lower part of the jar. Scrape off the excess off your brush, put the lid back on and give it a good old shake. That way it sends all of the exciting bits, all those chunks, all through the glaze. And you'll often find that if you give it a good shake, you can find all of the interest here on the lid. But what you can also do is pour it out after you've given it a good shake, and then you can see the disbursement is excellent. Take your brush, keep it tidy, otherwise it's very difficult to open that jar again. And put that to one side. Right, so we're going to start with our colour. This is nice. It's a project that gets started by adding the exciting things nice and quickly. There's not too much preparation for your customer before they start to use the exciting things. So we put on the Tree Frog, and I believe we're going to put on, how many layers are that? 2 or 3 good layers. Now it depends. It really does. So crystal glazes love to run. There's a lot of glass in there, and at cone 06 it's hot, and that loves to melt the glass. And if you have an awful lot of crystals at the bottom of your piece and that great heat, you may risk your piece having drips coming off of it and then fusing it onto the kiln shelf. So this doesn't matter too much up in our treetops up here, but I'll show you how we reseed our layers as we get lower down in our meadow. So I'm painting one good layer all over, beautiful citrus green. Now on my handle, you can see here, so I want to make my handle have colour in line with my tree line, so that because having a handle in the middle of a stripe is tricky, and so you want to be able to see from a distance that this is also part of the piece. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this layer and let it dry for a little while. I've got my first layer of Tree Frog on, looking awesome, and I'm going to let that dry for a little while, and I'm going to go to the bottom. I'm going to go to the meadow at the bottom so that I'm not butting up too much into the Tree Frog. I'm letting that dry for a moment. So I've given this a stir, I've given it a shake, and I'm going to tip it out, clean off the excess from my jar so that it doesn't make too much of a mess I'm going to decide where my line is of the Meadow, and I'm not giving it too much thought. So Meadow has a real mix of sized crystals in it. It has a lot of very fine ones. When you paint it on, you can see it has more of the small blue speck, and that's quite handy for us because we don't want too many big crystals so low. Usually when we paint with crystal glazes, we'll say don't paint below the lower 2/3 of a piece, but here I am painting my Meadow with quite a lot of confidence. So it's the size of the crystals that are important to me at this point. So I'm just going to put my glaze on all over, and I'm not making it a perfect straight line because I would like to have it look like an undulating meadow in the background of my trees. So I'll put that all on there. This is my first layer, and this is the only one that is going to go all the way down to the bottom, because when I put on a second layer, it is going to be higher up to minimize the amount of crystals that I'm going to have down. I want the color, of course I want the color, and of course I want the crystals. That's not a problem, but I don't want a disaster. But I won't have that because how could I? We're following our fantastic instructions on this. So we have our tree frog there and the Meadow down there. So the last one that I'm going to be putting on is Herb Garden. And Herb Garden is quite awesome because it has a little bit of a metallic sheen in it, which I love, which is always nice to achieve at Cone 06, because sometimes you have to wait till you have a luster or you have stoneware, but to have it in our 06 stuff is amazing. Makes it special. So these crystal glazes are on the outside of our piece, and that's important because if we were having crystal glazes too close to our lip line or on the inside of the piece, we would risk crazing, just because that glaze, having all that extra glass in it, especially the chunks, is pulling in all sorts of different directions and challenging the coefficient of expansion on the bisque to the glaze. And so to be wonderfully safe, we're putting it onto a foundation base, and we've got either foundation, clear glaze, or even watered down stroke and coat on the inside of our piece. And so it is going to be, of course, ready to use when it is fired. So I have got one layer of each one of the 3 crystal glazes all the way down my jug. So I have not necessarily even butted up to them the colours. I've left a little gap in between so that I don't contaminate jars and I don't mess around with the brushes too much. I've just made some, just got the main body of the glaze on. So I now can then start to work into it. So when you do that, when you start to blend it, you want to make sure that you're not dipping into the original jar, because the crystal glaze colours that are in there, you're expecting to see. If you suddenly see a shot of something else because you were mixing up with your brushes, then it's not necessarily going to give you the piece that you thought you were going to get. So I'll just make sure that I've got enough glazes out, because when I work, I want to make sure that I've got all the tools of my trade ready to go. Right, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to reapply my tree frog up to the line of the herb garden. And I'm not going to be worried about touching the wet herb garden. I'm going to blend it in. Just checking you can see. So I'm just going over that join line. Like that. Now, while that's still wet, I'm going to come along with my herb garden and I'm going to go over that line again, but from the other side. There we go, so I've done that, given it a nice blend. And if I think, oh, that's not blended very well, pick up your frog again, your tree frog, and give it an extra swish. Nice bit of extra work really pays off with that blending, so it's not too harsh a line. And so that is all sorted. So I will then take the Meadow and I'll do exactly the same. I'm going to come up to this line, go a little bit over it into the middle layer, the herb garden. Into that, into the handle, and working over, up and over into that line. And then with a new brush, because my blending was done with the tree frog and the herb garden, I'm going to use a new brush and do the herb garden into the meadow and do the blending that way. So these glazes, when they are the carrier glaze for the crystal glaze, they're quite sheer, so you can often see other colours underneath, and a sheer glaze is quite forgiving in its layering, and you've got all of the excitement of the crystals in the crystal glaze. So you can see there I've got the true herb garden with no blending, and here it's herb garden with the blending, and I'm so excited. It's going to look so pretty. So we've got our bits on, we've got our colours on. Now before it dries too much, we are going to peel off the paper, and that starts to reveal the shape of our trees. So remember how many we had on here? I had 8. So we're going to make sure that we have 8 strips of paper to take off. So you can see with that lovely foundation layer underneath there, peels off so beautifully, even if there's little bits that you wisp away. Now the question is, if I leave some paper on, will it cause a problem in the kiln? Well, it is a piece of paper that is absolutely coated with crystal glaze. So you can imagine in the heat of the kiln, when that glaze on top of the paper melts, gets to temperature, it's going to buckle and it's going to cause some very sharp faults in the glaze. So do not leave your paper on if you can. Always take it off, and this is why we count how many bits of paper we put on. Now I'm taking this off when it's quite wet. Well, I want to do that really because I don't want to tear the glaze. I don't want the glaze to chip off and make all jagged edges, but it won't do really. But I don't want the glaze to be too hard, because you can imagine that the paper is quite delicate and the glaze, if it dries, can be quite rigid, and it will make our job that bit harder. So I'm using my nails, but you could also use the back of a chisel edged brush, just avoiding, if I can, making any dents in the foundation that I have put down. So it's nice and easy to see because foundation FN1 has a little blue tinge to it, so it's always nice to see. It's very easy to identify. And so I then think I'm done, but I check, make sure you check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And while I was checking, I realized I'd forgotten this man here. So we take our last one off. If I hadn't counted, would I have seen him? So our next step, we've got these beautiful resist trees. And so our next job is to give them some colour. And the joy of having the foundation on there already allows us to add a bit of a blend in of our colour. So I've got Tip Taupe, which is SC83, and we're going to paint in the branch, or the trunk I should say, no branches at all, the trunk of our tree. And I'm watering down a little bit just so I get a really nice flow, but because we're painting onto foundation, it's not being absorbed too quickly into the bisque, and we get a really lovely smooth brush stroke because we want our trees to be lovely, tall and luscious. If you're doing this on a smaller piece like we were doing on this planter, that works in exactly the same way. It just gives a little bit of colour. If you go over into the crystal glaze, that's all right. Just leave that to dry and we can have a good look at it because the crystal glaze is wet as well. And what I like to do is when I've done the piece and before I'm about to put the black outline on, I will then go along with a wet brush and just remove any of the stroke and coat that's sitting on the crystal glaze. So you can actually be quite relaxed with this. Bearing in mind, I'm painting this into the torn line of my paper. And so that's not a dead straight line, which is quite nice really. It makes for a more relaxed project. There you go. Nice 2 layers of Tip Taupe all over my trees. So the actual instructions of this particular piece call for us putting cobblestone on before this. And I think the actual finish of it didn't really need it. So it also goes to show that you can take those projects and you can manipulate them to be what fits with your studio, because what we've taken is bisque that we already have on the shelf and we're going to be using stroke and coat, something you already have. Foundation, well, you can use also stroke and coat if you want to, if you don't want to introduce a new kind of glaze into your studio, but foundation worked very well. And then for a handful of the crystal glazes to really elevate this project to be something that's quite unique, then becomes a workshop that people can't necessarily access in the day-to-day running of the studio. It might be something that they just do in a workshop environment. And you've pre-planned it, so you don't have lots and lots of different jars and crystal glazes. You've just got what you need for the workshop, and it becomes something that's really achievable for you to have in your studio and set up as a regular set of projects that you can achieve through the whole year. And people then can plan their diaries. You can have your diary nice and fully prepaid and set to go, so you're actually set up for the season knowing that you've got your workshops nice and full and you've got the product ready to go for it, and you're not feeling at sea that you need to buy a lot of extra products. You've got things ready to go. So I've done all my layers on here and I haven't added the cobblestone, so you don't have to necessarily have that. If you want to, do add it between the foundation and this stroke and coat Tip Taupe, and then it will give an interesting texture to your trees. I've done it just as this. Now the next stage that I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I went over anywhere, and I was quite lucky that I didn't necessarily, but I'm going to go with a wet brush and just tidy up if I think that I've gone over the crystal glaze with the stroke and coat. But it's not a precise thing to worry about too much because we want it to look quite organic. We don't want to touch the piece too much. Every time we touch it, then more crystals come off it. So we're doing very well so far. We've just painted on these trees. Now, this is the final step. We came here already quite quickly. We're going to use quite a fine brush. And this particular one is the finest writing brush that I use all the time to do my writing with, and it's very, very long, so it holds quite a lot of glaze. And I'm going to just use stroke and coat Tuxedo SC15, and I'm going to paint in, let me move this out the way, the outline of my trees and some marks for the bark. So you can see, you can choose, you can have lots and lots of marks of your bark, you can have just a few, you could put knots in it as well if you want to, and you can see here where I've gone over the crystal gem that it isn't too much of a disaster. It makes for a really interesting side of the tree. Obviously I don't want to do it all the way down, but I wouldn't be too worried about making perfect straight thick lines. My brush strokes here, they start and they finish. I try and start them again where I have had a thicker part, and then I keep on going with it down. Obviously my brush stroke isn't going to be loaded enough to do the full length of this tree, but I've added a little bit of water to allow it to have the longest run as it possibly can. So I'll go ahead and do that so you can see what I mean. So while I'm doing these lines here, I'm reloading my brush often. I'm starting off again where I've got thicker paint and pulling it down, and I've done a second layer up. It's not perfect at all. It is not uniform at all, but it is lovely. It is a lovely project to do because you're just letting your brush run down. Now, if it is dragging and is breaking, then add a little bit of water to your black, because it's all right that it's a little bit watered down because you don't want it to be a solid, angry line. Also, what I would suggest is not leaning your hand on the crystal glazes too much, because it is going to lift them up and you'll have a big pile of the exciting parts of the glaze underneath your jug, and you'll have very little actually on the jug for when it goes into the kiln. So I'm going to be quiet for a little while I do all of my tree trunks. Here you can see I have drawn the trunks of my trees in down the smoother side of the trunk where we pulled away the paper. So not over the crystal glaze part, but over the foundation and the stroke and coat part. So my next step now is to draw in my lines on my trunk to make it look very realistic. And so this is hard. This is hard because you have to lean a little bit onto the crystal glazes, but you want to be as soft as you can with your brush. So I'm really using only the very tip of this brush. So always go back to your water, and it takes off any of the remaining paint and gives you that tip again. And sometimes go all the way across, sometimes just do lots and lots of flicks like this. On the instructions from Mako, they have lots and lots of flicks like this going across, and I have done them across the whole length of it in different sections just to give a little bit of interest. The idea is, I suppose, also that it gives a little bit of shading and interest along the whole of the thing. So this is what your next job will be, to go across the tree, and you think to yourself, oh, that one's too thick, oh, that's too thin. But when you look at the whole actual piece, you'll never remember that you thought that that one was too thick or too thin, because they just look very interesting, like knots of wood. And where the silver birch is peeled away, because its trunk does that, doesn't it? The bark peels away. So you can see here that I have got that tree trunk finished there. So I will then continue to do that on the remaining 7 of my trees. And what I will do before I go and take this into the kiln is I will give a little bit of a very light rub over this lower portion of the crystal glaze on the Meadow, just so the bigger chunks are not the main part that I'm going to see here down below, because if those ones run a little bit too much, then that will go onto my kiln shelf. Now this particular piece I'm going to dry foot, but I'm going to put it on their kiln shelf directly once I've wiped off all of the glaze, because it's a vase, and I think it's more sturdy and it's going to be happier on my work surface with a dry foot area, because it's going to be quite heavy when it's full of water. That's my personal preference. And so that, when it's got all of its lines on it for the bark, is ready to be put into the kiln. Now, bearing in mind, if you're doing this for a workshop and you may have 6, 10, 15 ladies or more, you will have very similar looking jugs. So what I would suggest is painting the bottom with a brighter colour, something that you may have lined it with, or with a stroke and coat colour, and then using a skewer to allow the ladies to sign their artwork. So they're using a sgraffito technique just with a skewer into 2 or 3 coats of stroke and coat will really give them a wonderful personalization of the piece. It will also help you to make sure that everybody gets their beautiful piece back, and it makes life a little less stressful for you. So I really hope you enjoy using the crystal gems, and on all sorts of different kinds of shapes. There will be a link to this project from Mako underneath on this recording, so you'll be able to see how it's written out, and you can also have the link that will be to all of the crystal gems and glazes that we've used today, and the brushes to get you directly onto Hobby Surround Crafts website. Thank you very much. Enjoy painting.